7 years ago, a young boy named Christopher Pittman came into my life, and it set me on a journey I never could have expected. Christopher was a 12-year-old boy in South Carolina, and he'd been given a 30-year sentence without possibility of parole for killing his beloved grandparents. He'd been having an adverse reaction to a new antidepressant medication he'd just begun taking. This case was tragic and heartbreaking at so many different levels. And now here he was at age 12, not old enough for high school or even to get in to see a Harry Potter movie on his own. And he was facing a sentence almost 3 times as long as he'd been alive. And the judge who sentenced him in this case, an adult criminal court judge, had no discretion at all under the law to impose a shorter sentence because of his young age. Christopher's legal team approached me and asked me to conduct some research to find out how unusual his case was. Were there other young kids going into the adult criminal justice system and facing such incredibly long sentences? I was thunderstruck by this case. I'd been working on prison reform issues for more than 2 decades at that point, and I had no idea that there were kids as young as Christopher in the adult system. Wasn't that what the juvenile justice system was for, I wondered? The fact that I had a then 12-year-old daughter made me even more upset about the way he was being treated. This was one of those personal defining moments that so completely engages you emotionally that you just can't sit on the sidelines. You have to get involved to try to make a difference. My students and I set out on this research task, and what we learned resulted in our writing a series of reports over the last several years. Our work has led to a variety of efforts to try to change the laws and policies that affect kids under the age of 18 in the adult criminal justice system. What I want to talk to you about today are 3 things. First, who are these kids going into the adult system? How did they get there in the first place, and what have they done? And 2, what happens to them when they're confined in adult prisons and jails? And finally, 3, what do we need to do to change this situation? As we went about our work, I was shocked to discover how widespread this practice is of kids going into the adult system. More than half the states allow kids 12 and over to be prosecuted as adults. And there are 22 states in which a child as young as 7 can be prosecuted as an adult. Think about that, age 7. What were you doing at age 7? Playing with dolls, skateboards, learning addition in 2nd grade. One day, these kids are facing time out for their misbehavior, and the next day, they're facing hard time. What's really crazy about this situation is that the juvenile justice system was designed to work with kids this age, whether they've committed minor offenses or even serious crimes like murder. Juvenile court provides age-appropriate interventions that are designed to take advantage of the fact that the teenage brain is still malleable, that kids' characters are still forming. Kids can still be held accountable in juvenile court, but the focus is on rehabilitation rather than on merely being punitive. In contrast, if these kids go into adult court, they are facing a lifetime of consequences from having an adult criminal court record. They're not going to be getting the rehabilitative programs and the services that they need. And depending on the seriousness of the crime, they can be facing incredibly long sentences, sometimes even life without possibility of parole. Sometimes those sentences are even mandatory. This is not just a theoretical concern. Just a few weeks ago, a 10-year-old boy in Pennsylvania was charged as an adult in a murder case. This little boy, who's reported to be mentally ill, is currently awaiting trial in an adult jail. And if he's convicted, he's facing a mandatory sentence of 25 years to life. I don't know whether to be reassured or horrified by the fact that he's apparently getting coloring books to keep him entertained in the jail. Coloring books. Now, I want to be clear. I'm in no way trying to excuse the seriousness of the crimes committed by this 10-year-old boy or by Christopher. I'm not suggesting they should be let off the hook. There were real victims here, and there needs to be accountability for these youth. And above all, these boys need treatment to make sure they're not going to reoffend again. But when we look to the adult criminal justice system rather than the juvenile justice system to deal with kids this age, then we have lost all rational sense of what our justice system is supposed to be. Okay, you're probably thinking, well, at least we're talking about the worst of the worst. These kids have probably all committed murder, right? Well, I assumed that that was the case too until I learned that that was a myth. Many kids go into adult court for property offenses, not just for violent crimes. In some states, only a small fraction of them have been charged with murder. And in many cases, they're first-time offenders. If you look at their criminal court records and their offenses, they look an awful lot like the kids who remain in the juvenile system. In fact, it turns out that whether a kid goes into adult court turns much more heavily on which county he comes from or which judge handled the case than with what his offense is or what his record looks like. That kind of arbitrariness is outrageous, and it should make us really uncomfortable. Perhaps the greatest injustice of all, though, is where we confine these kids when they're transferred to adult court. And that brings me to the second thing I want to talk to you about today. Many states require or allow kids who are charged as adults to be held in adult jails while they're awaiting trial, while they're still innocent in the eyes of the law, and in adult prisons if they're convicted. There are about 10,000 kids under the age of 18 currently being confined in adult prisons and jails in the United States today. There are very serious problems with holding them there. Youth who are held with adult prisoners have much greater risks of physical and sexual assault than those held in the juvenile system. They've got vastly higher rates of suicide. In one facility I went into, I talked to a 15-year-old boy who only wanted to talk about AIDS. He assumed that he would be infected with AIDS due to the ever-present risk of rape in prison. For those youth that aren't mixed in with adult prisoners, they're often held in solitary confinement for their own protection. That's 23-hour-a-day lockup with 1 hour a day of out-of-cell time. They're not getting the programs or services or even education. I went into a jail, a large urban jail, and talked to a 16-year-old boy who'd been locked up in solitary confinement for 2 years since he'd been 14 years old. He told me that in those 2 years that he was locked up while awaiting trial, he had never seen natural light. He was locked in a cell block that had no windows, and the jail had no outdoor recreation yard. Think about the impact that isolation and deprivation would have on a child's mental health, on their social development, on their intellectual development, or even their physical development. Another prison I went to was a high-security, rural, plantation-style prison. It held adult inmates as well as juveniles ages 14 to 17, but the juveniles were held on their own cell block. The architecture of this juvenile wing can only be described as cage upon cage upon cage upon cage. I was looking at kids in cages, mostly brown and black faces. There were 4 rows of tiny 40-square-foot cells, metal bars, double bunks, a stainless steel toilet. There was paint peeling off the walls and the ceilings of the cell. There was trash on the walkway in front of the cell. There was no air conditioning despite the triple-digit stifling heat in summer. They could be held there until their 18th birthday when they're moved in with adult prisoners. That's quite the birthday present. Do you know how small 40 square feet is? It's 5 feet by 8 feet. It's about the size of the typical bathroom. At another prison I went to, I climbed the stairs of a tower of a building, and I found a girl in segregation at the end of a long, otherwise deserted cell block. I felt like I was visiting Rapunzel up in her tower. No one would ever have occasion to go past this cell. There was an officer stationed at a desk who could look down the hall, and presumably he often went to check on her, but other than that, she had no contact with anyone. I went down there to speak to her. She was huddled under a blanket on her bed in her cell, or metal bars on the cell. She was 16 years old. She seemed stunned that anyone was there to see her. Her arms were scarred from years of self-cutting. She said that she'd been there for several weeks already. I asked her how she spent her time, and she said she slept all day. I've been going into prisons and talking to prisoners for many years, and it's rare for me to cry after talking with someone who's locked up. But I had tears in my eyes as I walked away from this girl's cell. If a parent treated a child like this, it would be considered abuse. Why can't we as a society set a standard that we should treat these children the way we would want our own child treated if he or she got into trouble? The fact of the matter is that adult prisons and jails are simply a poor fit for these kids in adult jails. This photo of a child inmate in an outsized prison uniform is a perfect metaphor for the plight of children in adult prisons and jails. The photographer who took these amazing photos, Steve Liss, did an incredible job of capturing the dissonance between these youth and the wholly inappropriate environment in which they're kept. So that brings me to my last point. What do we need to do to change the situation? First, we need to change the laws and policies that allow kids under the age of 18 to be held in adult prisons and jails. Not only is this practice inhumane, it's also counterproductive from a public safety perspective. Research shows that youth in adult facilities have a 34% greater risk of recidivism than those who are held in juvenile settings. That's because the juvenile system is better equipped to work with these kids. The focus is on rehabilitation, on changing lives, on giving kids a second chance. One young man I know, a graduate of the juvenile justice system, was a tough teenage thug who committed armed robberies regularly without a thought for his victims. Jason was 15 when he finally went to a juvenile facility. And while he was there, he got to take part in an intensive treatment program for violent juvenile offenders. He got his GED, he took some college classes. Today, he's a graduate of business school, and he runs his own company. He's clean-cut, and he's articulate, and he's testified before state legislative committees. He stands as a shining example of what the juvenile justice system can accomplish when we don't treat them as throwaway kids. Second thing we need to do. We need to get rid of mandatory sentencing laws that apply to youth who do end up in the adult system. No child should be given a life term or even a long sentence without the opportunity for the judge to consider mitigating factors such as how young he is, or his potential for rehabilitation, or whatever horrific traumas he's experienced in his life. And third, we need to fix the laws in a handful of states, in places like New York, and North Carolina, and Texas, handful of other places, that say that you're an adult for all criminal justice purposes when you turn 16 or 17. There's something really wrong about being considered an adult in the eyes of the court before you're old enough to vote or even to serve on the jury that convicted you. Having the age set that low at 16 or 17 just pushes more kids into adult prisons and jails, and it ensures that those kids who have committed minor offenses, things like shoplifting or graffiti or underage drinking, it ensures that they end up with an adult criminal court record that will haunt them the rest of their lives. We need to raise the minimum age for adult court to 18. Fortunately, this issue has been getting more attention in recent years. Some state legislatures have passed laws and changed the policies so that they can keep more kids in the juvenile system and pull kids out of adult prisons and jails. The federal government has recently issued standards to address prison rape, and it's mandating that kids under the age of 18 be kept separate from adult prisoners. That's providing more incentive to pull them out of these adult facilities and get them out of these cages. This is a start, but so much more needs to be done. When I talk to a youth in an adult prisoner jail, when I talk to that boy who hadn't seen sunlight in 2 years, or the girl with the scarred arms who was huddled in her cell, or the 15-year-old boy who was terrified of catching AIDS. I don't see a child who is convicted of murder or an unmanageable inmate or a gang member. I see a kid who is scared, lonely, depressed, resigned, traumatized, bored, or hopeless. I see a kid who's in an environment that is entirely unsuited to him. I see a kid who could benefit from the programs and the services available through the juvenile system. I see a kid who is dealing with mental illness. I see a kid who could benefit from a healthy relationship with a caring adult. We need to stop treating them as throwaway kids. No child is beyond the possibility of redemption. I was talking with my students about these issues last week, and one of my students asked me, "Why aren't you angry all the time?" And I responded, I'd rather fight for change, and anger alone doesn't get us anywhere. But as I thought about this some more, I realized I am angry. Anger is what helped create my own defining moment. It's what motivated me to get involved. It's what helped create the passion that sustains my commitment to reform. And I hope what we've talked about today gets you angry too. Because if we can get enough of us angry about this situation, then maybe we'll have a defining moment for real social change. Thank you.